The topic of this lecture is the endocrine system. The endocrine system in many ways performs the same sorts of roles as the nervous system. That is, it allows cells of the body to communicate with one another. Now, that's very important for coordinating activities within the body. This figure shows the basic setup of the endocrine system. Here we have a cell releasing a chemical signal. It enters the bloodstream. Once it does that, we call it a hormone. This hormone signal will then target another cell, could be quite distant from the original cell. There'll be interaction between this hormone chemical signal and the target cell will undergo some sort of change, and hopefully that change will help the body function. Here we'll consider why we actually need an endocrine system. Well, previously we've spoken about how cells make up your body. Now, these cells, their activities must be coordinated effectively for you to function normally. One way we coordinate what our cells, tissues and organs do is by communication via the nervous system. We've already covered that in detail. The other main way we send messages around the body is by releasing chemicals into the blood we call hormones. This is the job of the endocrine system. This summarizes the basic properties of each of these communication systems in the body. Firstly, we have our nervous system, built on nervous tissues, in particular the neurons which transmit the information. They transmit the information via action potentials and the release of neurotransmitter molecules at the synapse. The communication is relatively rapid, but it's short-lived. The endocrine system is the other key system of the body for communicating between cells and tissues. This system, as I've already mentioned, operates by releasing chemical signals into the bloodstream. The chemical signals will then target cells downstream somewhere in the bloodstream. Now, typically, the responses initiated by the endocrine system are slower than those initiated by the nervous system. However, the effects initiated by the endocrine system are often longer lasting than those initiated by the nervous system. Now, before I leave this slide, it's important to stress that these two systems of communication do not operate in isolation from one another. There is integration between these two systems, as we'll touch upon later in this lecture. The endocrine system has three basic components to it. The first are the glands that actually produce the chemical signals. These are the endocrine glands, and typically they are derived from epithelial tissue. Here we have an endocrine cell here from an endocrine gland. It is producing the chemical signal, that's the blue dot there. Once that enters the bloodstream, that's called a hormone. The second key element of the endocrine system is the hormones. These are chemical substances secreted into the bloodstream. These will flow through the bloodstream, they'll target cells elsewhere in the body, and they'll initiate some response on the target cell. It could be a response that changes the metabolism of the cell or stimulates growth. The third key element of the endocrine system are the target cells. These are the targets for the hormones. Now, to be able to respond to a particular hormone, you need a specific molecule called a receptor. That receptor can be localized on your cell membrane or within the cell. Once the hormone and the receptor on the target cell interact, a change in the function or activity of this target cell is initiated. Cell division might occur, or there might be secretion of a particular product. There's a wide range of responses that are possible. Now, hopefully whatever response is occurring will help the body function more effectively. So let's just cover that all over again. Three key elements of the endocrine system: the cells that manufacture the chemical signals, the chemical signals themselves which flow through the bloodstream and are called hormones, and the target cell, the cell that responds to the chemical signal, bearing in mind that this cell must have a specific receptor for the particular chemical hormone. Now, the endocrine system is often a hard system to represent because the organs of the endocrine system are scattered widely throughout the body. The other feature about the endocrine system is the organs within it do not only just make hormones, they may have other very important roles for the body. For example, the reproductive organs here, the testes in the male, they are endocrine organs, but they're also important reproductive organs. The pancreas is an important endocrine organ, but it's also an important digestive organ. So many of the structures we are looking at have multiple functions apart from just making hormones. The key characteristic, however, of any endocrine organ is that it will make a chemical signal. That chemical signal will be released into the blood, and that signal will target some other cell somewhere else in the body and initiate a change. And all that hopefully will help maintain homeostasis. I'll just draw to your attention a couple of very important endocrine structures, the hypothalamus and pituitary gland. Much of the regulation of the functions of the endocrine system involves these two structures, and we'll talk about those very soon. So what I'll do in this slide is I'll talk a little bit about what a hormone actually is. It's a chemical substance secreted by endocrine cells into extracellular fluids, and in particular the bloodstream. The basic characteristics, well, secreted into the blood, and as I mentioned in the previous slides, it has to bind to a specific receptor. So a cell can only respond to a hormone if it has a specific receptor for that hormone, either in its cell membrane or within the cell. Hormones typically are very potent. They initiate change at low concentrations. They're then rapidly degraded by enzymes in the target cell, liver or kidneys, which is important because you don't want the signal persisting beyond when it's actually needed. Once it's initiated the change that's needed, we can shut it down again. Hormones secreted by endocrine organs within the body can have a wide range of effects on different target cells. For example, some hormones will trigger events associated with growth and development, such as, for example, growth hormone secreted by the pituitary gland, which stimulates the growth of body tissues. You will also get hormones that trigger glands to secrete products. For example, many of the solutions that are found within the gastrointestinal tract that initiate digestion, their secretion is regulated by hormones. Hormones can also be involved in regulating key physiological processes. For example, the hormones insulin and glucagon are very important for regulating the level of glucose in the bloodstream. In this section, we're going to discuss the chemistry of the hormones secreted by endocrine organs. We're going to look at two basic groups: hormones constructed from amino acids and hormones constructed around the molecule cholesterol. This shows the amino acid based hormones. Amino acids are the basic building materials of proteins. Now, you can take a single amino acid and make what we call a monoamine hormone out of that. So one or two amino acids stuck together, very small molecule, can make one of these amino acid based hormones. If you string together many of these amino acids, you get a peptide hormone, so 3 or more. This is an example of a peptide hormone here. This is insulin. Each one of these circles in these two strands is a separate amino acid. So the key thing about this group of hormones is that they are based on the same building blocks, that's the amino acids, that make up all the proteins in our body. The second major group of hormones that we're going to discuss today are the steroid hormones, and these are based around the molecule cholesterol. So here we have the 4-ring steroid backbone, which is the fundamental element in all the steroid hormones. Examples of this type of hormone include testosterone, cortisol and aldosterone, so based on a cholesterol molecule. A key concept I mentioned earlier was that for a hormone to have an effect on a target cell, the target cell must contain a receptor that recognizes that hormone. If we look at the location of the receptors, we can see that there are two main places where they're found. Firstly, they can be found within the cell membrane. So located within the cell membrane is a receptor for a specific hormone. Typically, this is what we see with the amino acid based hormones. So the hormone does not have to enter the cell to initiate the effect. What it does is it binds to a specific receptor embedded on the target cell membrane. What will then happen is there will be a cascade of interactions within the cell that keep the signal going. For example, through the production of secondary messenger molecules which spread throughout the cell and keep the signal going. An example of this is cyclic AMP. Receptors for hormones can also be located inside the target cell. This is the case with the steroid receptor hormones. We also have receptors for some of the amino acid-based hormones, the very, very small ones that are located within the target cell. For example, the receptor for thyroid hormone, and thyroid hormone is an amino acid-based hormone, that has a receptor which is actually inside the nucleus. So, key thing to think about here, the receptors for hormones can be based in the cell membrane or within the cell. Typically, amino acid-based hormones bind to those receptors that are on the cell membrane, and the steroids and the very, very small amino acid-based hormones, their receptors are inside the cell. This image here is just highlighting the concepts that I've been speaking about. Here we have a cell membrane, phospholipid bilayer there, the fatty acid tails which are hydrophobic, and the charged phosphate groups facing the water either inside or outside the cell. Within that cell membrane we have a receptor. It's a protein molecule and it's embedded within the cell membrane. Here it is interacting with an amino acid based hormone. So this might be something like insulin, that large peptide hormone I showed you before. So the key thing here is that the hormone does not enter the cell to initiate a response. It binds to a specific receptor within the cell membrane. After that occurs, there will be internal cellular machinery that takes over the signaling process. In particular, the generation of secondary messenger molecules, such as cyclic AMP, that keep the whole process going. On this side, we have an example of a receptor for a hormone located within the cell, and it's a receptor for a steroid hormone. Notice here we've got a steroid hormone and it's passing straight through the cell membrane and it's binding to the receptor here within the cell. One of the reasons why the steroid hormone can pass through this cell membrane is because its chemistry is very similar to the chemistry of this phospholipid bilayer. So hormones are very important signals within the body that allow cells to communicate with one another. Typically, these hormones act at very low concentrations. You don't need much to get an effect. As a consequence, it's important that the level of hormone secretion is carefully controlled. Too much or too little hormone secretion can be a bad thing. There are three key ways by which we can regulate the secretion of a particular hormone. The first is through changes in the levels of ions or nutrients within the blood. For example, after eating food, there is a rise in the level of glucose in the bloodstream. This will trigger the release of insulin from the pancreas, and that will help move the glucose from the bloodstream into the body cells. Neural stimuli can also regulate hormone secretion, and in particular the autonomic nervous system can have a powerful effect on the secretion of hormones in the body. The presence or absence of other hormones in the bloodstream can also have a powerful effect on the secretion of hormones from particular organs or structures. And in a little while I'll emphasize that when I talk about the role of the pituitary gland in controlling hormone secretion from many of the endocrine organs in the body. So I've emphasized the fact that hormones can exert their effects at very low concentrations. We therefore need to control those levels. And I've just been speaking about that now. If we get the level of hormone secretion wrong, that can have serious consequences from the body. For example, if we get hyposecretion, that's insufficient secretion of a particular hormone, that can be a major problem for the body. Here's one example of that. There's a hormone released by the posterior pituitary gland called Antidiuretic Hormone that has an important function in regulating the retention of water in the body. If we have a situation where there's insufficient secretion of this hormone, for example as a consequence of head injury, that can lead to a condition called diabetes insipidus, which is where there is excessive urine production. So hyposecretion means insufficient hormone produced. Hypersecretion is the opposite of that, too much hormone being released. An example of hypersecretion is where too much growth hormone is made from the pituitary gland, leading to a condition called acromegaly or giantism. This can sometimes occur as a result of a tumour in this tissue within the pituitary. In this section, I'll talk about one of the most important elements of the endocrine system, that is the relationship between the hypothalamus within the brain and the pituitary gland. We've already spoken about the hypothalamus previously. Well, it's attached directly to a small gland which is sitting inferior to it, called the pituitary gland. This pituitary gland is responsible for releasing a range of hormones. Now, many of these hormones released by the pituitary will act upon other endocrine glands of the body. As a consequence, we refer to the pituitary gland often as the master endocrine gland. If we look at the pituitary gland under the microscope, we can see it's composed of two distinct sections. There is a front or anterior lobe, and this is based on epithelial tissue. Then there's a posterior lobe, that is based on nervous tissue, and it's essentially an extension of the hypothalamus. This shows the location of the hypothalamus and the pituitary. The hypothalamus is part of the brain, and we've looked at that previously. The pituitary gland sits here, directly attached to the hypothalamus by a stalk. The pituitary gland is about the size of a pea. It sits in an indentation in the sphenoid bone we call the hypophyseal fossa. But the main thing to note is the close anatomical relationship between these two structures, hypothalamus and pituitary gland. There is a direct structural and functional relationship between the hypothalamus and pituitary. As I showed you in the previous image, we could see a direct anatomical connection of the pituitary gland to the hypothalamus, that little stalk-like structure. There is also a strong direct functional relationship between the hypothalamus and the pituitary. In particular, there are interactions between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland that are very important for controlling the functions of many of the other endocrine glands in the body. And we'll go through some of these mechanisms now. We'll start firstly with the relationship that exists between the hypothalamus and the anterior part of the pituitary. Basically what happens here is that there are signals, hormones, released by the hypothalamus that flow through the bloodstream and trigger the anterior pituitary to secrete other hormones. The anterior pituitary hormones often stimulate how other endocrine glands in the body are secreting hormones. Here we have a diagram of the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. It's enlarged on this section here, so this yellow part is the hypothalamus, part of the brain, and beneath that we have the pituitary. Now we're focusing on the anterior part of the pituitary, the anterior lobe. This part is based on epithelial tissue, so those little blue cells there, they're representing epithelial cells. These red channels, that's the local bloodstream. Up here we have neurons that are located in the hypothalamus. Now there's a relationship between these neurons here and these endocrine cells here. In particular, what happens is that these neurons will secrete hormones. Those hormones enter the local bloodstream. They then flow down this vessel here, and when they get to this region here where the epithelial cells are, those cells are triggered to release other hormones. So hormones made here by the neurons in the hypothalamus, released into the local bloodstream, trigger cells of the anterior pituitary to release other hormones. Now typically the hormones released by the anterior pituitary will target other endocrine glands in the body. That's a real key relationship to learn when studying the endocrine system. Because it's such an important relationship, this relationship between the hypothalamus and the pituitary, we'll take a few seconds to go over it again. Firstly, here we have our neurons in the hypothalamus. The yellow dots here, they are indicating hormones that are produced by these neurons. They've been released now into the bloodstream, and you can see them making their way through this capillary network, and eventually they'll get here to the anterior pituitary. These cells in the anterior pituitary will have specific receptors for hormones from the hypothalamus, and they will now respond to those hormones. This is showing you what the anterior pituitary cells do once they're acted upon by hormones of the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus hormones have targeted the anterior pituitary cells here, and what is occurring now is that these cells are producing their own hormones. That's the green cross. They will flow into the bloodstream and target something else downstream. Typically, the target of these hormones is another gland in the body that produces hormones. And for this reason, the anterior pituitary is referred to as the master endocrine gland of the body. This shows some of the target organs which are acted upon by hormones made by the anterior pituitary. First of all, once again refreshing the whole concept, we have neurons in the hypothalamus releasing hormones. They flow to the local bloodstream, targeting cells in the anterior pituitary. Those anterior pituitary cells now make other hormones. This here indicates the targets of some of the hormones made by the anterior pituitary. Thyroid stimulating hormone made by the pituitary targets the thyroid gland. Prolactin targets the mammary glands. Adrenocorticotrophic hormone targets the adrenal glands, and so on. So all of these hormones listed here originated from the anterior pituitary, and their release was controlled by communication that was occurring between neurons in the hypothalamus and cells in the anterior pituitary. So a key concept to try and understand is that there is this axis of communication between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary, and the hormones released by the anterior pituitary affect many other endocrine structures in the body, and that's why we call the anterior pituitary the master endocrine gland of the body. Here we're just summarizing some of the hormones produced by the anterior pituitary that I was speaking about before. Thyroid stimulating hormone stimulates the thyroid gland to release a second hormone which is called thyroid hormone, and we'll talk briefly about the thyroid gland soon. Adrenocorticotrophic hormone, or ACTH, released by the anterior pituitary, it acts upon the adrenal glands and causes the release of a hormone called cortisol. That's very important for regulating nutrient metabolism, and there's a condition that we'll refer to later called Cushing syndrome, where this is being overproduced. Growth hormone I've also mentioned briefly. That's very important for promoting growth of body tissues, mobilizes fat, and if we produce too much of it, we get a condition called acromegaly or giantism. Okay, so far I've spoken only about hormones made by the anterior part of the pituitary gland. Now the back or the posterior part of the pituitary gland is also important within the endocrine system. It releases hormones. The hormones released by the posterior pituitary are not made in the pituitary, they've actually come down from neurons that are based within the hypothalamus. The tissue structure of the posterior pituitary is not like the anterior part. The anterior part is based on epithelial tissue. The posterior pituitary is based on nervous tissue. And what happens, as I said before, is neurons in the hypothalamus are making hormones which are then moved down along the axons into the posterior pituitary, where the hormones are stored until they're needed. One example of a posterior pituitary hormone is Antidiuretic Hormone. Its key role is to help maintain fluid balance. It acts upon the nephrons and it stimulates the reabsorption of water to help prevent dehydration. So this hormone is made in the hypothalamus, it's then moved into the posterior pituitary and then released into the bloodstream. If you don't produce enough of this, you get a condition called diabetes insipidus, where you get copious amounts of dilute urine produced. This is because you're losing the ability to direct the nephrons in the kidney to reabsorb more water. This shows how the endocrine system is set up in the posterior pituitary. Notice here we have neurons extending all the way into the posterior pituitary. So the neurons have their cell bodies in the hypothalamus. There they make hormones. One of those that I've just spoken about is antidiuretic hormone. That gets moved down the axon. The hormones are then stored here, and when needed they are released into the local bloodstream. So a key functional difference between the anterior and posterior pituitary is that the anterior pituitary produces hormones. The posterior pituitary, by contrast, only stores hormones made in the hypothalamus before they are released. In this section of the lecture, I'll just review a few of the other major endocrine glands of the body. Here we can see the thyroid gland, located inferior to the larynx, composed of a left lobe and right lobe, which you can see there. There's the two lobes of it, and there's this narrow isthmus portion located anterior to the cartilage rings 2 and 3 on the trachea. This organ is responsible for making a couple of very important hormones. Firstly, thyroid hormone. That has a major effect on increasing the body's metabolic rate, increasing heat production, and also increasing the heart and respiratory rate. The thyroid gland also produces a second hormone called calcitonin. This promotes the deposition of calcium into bone. If we view the posterior aspect of the thyroid gland, we can see 4 small parathyroid glands, and they make a hormone called parathyroid hormone that it works in an opposite way to calcitonin, so it triggers the release of calcium from the skeleton back into the bloodstream. Now, in the previous slide I mentioned that thyroid hormone produced by the thyroid gland is very important for regulating metabolism within cells of the body. It's also important for early development, and if you don't produce enough of it, you can get a condition called cretinism here. So in this slide here, this image here, we're seeing someone who's suffering the unfortunate condition called cretinism. The symptoms of this: short stature, thick tongue and neck, and mental retardation. And here we have an image of somebody who's only 3.5 feet tall, 44-year-old male sufferer of hypothyroidism. That means they're not making enough thyroid hormone, and one of the worst consequences of it is their severe mental retardation. The case notes from this study indicated that the individual was completely uncommunicative. All of this has occurred from a failure to secrete sufficient thyroid hormone to promote normal development. So it's just an example of how important the correct secretion of specific hormones in the body is. Here we see another very important couple of endocrine glands in the body. These are the adrenal glands, located on the superior aspect of the kidneys. Now, if we take a look inside the adrenal glands, there are 2 main components to it. There is an outer cortex based on epithelial tissue, and there is an inner medulla based on nervous tissue. Hormones produced by the cortex typically have an effect on iron or nutrient metabolism, while hormones released from the medulla typically help the functions of the sympathetic nervous system. Here we've listed a couple of very important hormones that are secreted by the adrenal cortex. Both of these are steroid hormones, that is, they're based on the cholesterol molecule. The first hormone is aldosterone, released by the adrenal cortex. It has an important role in regulating the balance of sodium ions and potassium ions in the blood, and also the rate at which they're secreted. And if you can cast your mind back to when we were thinking about the nephron, I mentioned that the distal convoluted tubule, the absorption of materials there, was affected by hormones. One of them is aldosterone. So sodium reabsorption from this structure and also potassium excretion is affected by aldosterone. The other hormone I'll mention is cortisol. This is secreted in response to stress, and it acts on nutrient metabolism. In particular, it stimulates fat and protein breakdown and triggers the production of glucose. So if we're under stress, we have an energy reserve readily available. If the secretion lasts too long, we can actually suppress the immune system. And overproduction of cortisol can lead to a condition called Cushing's syndrome. And here we can see the effect of overproduction of cortisol. This is the Cushing syndrome that I just spoke about. It's due to excess cortisol secretion, typically because up in the pituitary gland, adrenocorticotropic hormone is being overproduced, and that is the hormone that triggers the release of the cortisol from the adrenal glands. So the overproduction of cortisol in this case is leading to high blood sugar, loss of muscle and bone, but in particular what's very obvious is the deposition of fat. And here we have a poor individual here who is suffering Cushing syndrome because they're producing too much cortisol and they're depositing a lot more fat on their bodies. In this last section, I'll talk about another endocrine gland, the pancreas. It's important because it produces hormones that regulate blood glucose. However, as we've discussed previously, the pancreas is also a very important component of the digestive system. It produces digestive enzymes, and it also produces bicarbonate ion. If we look closely at the tissue of the pancreas, we see small patches of cells called islets of Langerhans, and they produce hormones that regulate blood glucose. One of these cell populations is the alpha cells. they secrete a hormone called glucagon, and that will trigger the release of stored glucose, in particular glucose that has been stored in the liver in a molecule we call glycogen. This release of glucose has the effect of increasing blood glucose levels. So if your blood glucose levels are a bit low, glucagon produced by alpha cells will bring it back up again. On the other side, we have beta cells within the islets of Langerhans. This is a population of cells that produces insulin, and insulin will trigger the uptake of glucose from the blood into the cells of the body. And this is often done when you've eaten food, the blood glucose levels go up, insulin is secreted, and the glucose moves from the bloodstream into the cells of the body. This has the effect of lowering the blood glucose levels. And there's a balance between the secretion of these hormones to make sure that the blood glucose levels are relatively stable. Now, you've seen an image like this before. It's showing you the pancreas with its body here, the head and the tail, and here you have the duodenum, and you've got the abdominal aorta there. What we're showing you now is an image of the tissue structure of the pancreas, and what we're highlighting is this patch of cells here, the islets of Langerhans. These are small patches of cells sitting in with the rest of the pancreas that are making the hormones which regulate blood glucose. For the next few slides, I'll show how insulin released by the pancreas helps to regulate blood glucose levels. So this is an experiment that can be done simply in a lot of your physiology pracs. What we do here is we take measurements of blood glucose before and after ingesting a solution of glucose. We have this graph here. On this side, we have the concentration of glucose that will be within the blood, and here we have a time course. Now, at the start of the experiment, the individual will take in 75 grams of glucose. Eventually, that glucose will be taken into the bloodstream and the blood glucose levels will increase, as you see here. So this is after the glucose has been ingested, moving from the intestines into the bloodstream. At that point, this elevated blood glucose will trigger the secretion of insulin by beta cells in the islets of Langerhans. The insulin will enter the bloodstream and then it will act upon the cells. The cells of the body will then take in the glucose. So there'll be a movement of glucose from the bloodstream into the cells. And then it'll taper off here back down to the original resting level. So this happens every time you have some food. Glucose levels go up, insulin is secreted, and then the glucose levels drop back down again as the glucose moves from the bloodstream and into the cells, and you're back down here to the original values. Now, in some instances, the mechanisms regulating glucose homeostasis can break down and disease can result. One such condition is that of diabetes mellitus. It's where there's a disruption of carbohydrate, fat, and protein metabolism. There's a couple of different types. Type 1 is where there's a loss of beta cells in the islets of Langerhans, and it appears to be an autoimmune disease. This represents about 10% of cases and is first evident in childhood. This form of diabetes mellitus requires insulin to treat the disease. There's another type, type 2, which is the majority of cases in adults. It's much more common. It's where there's normal or elevated insulin levels, but the cells can't respond to the insulin. They're resistant to it. And there's a strong association with this disease and obesity. In particular, fat cells produce secretions that interfere with glucose uptake. In this diagram, we're showing the effect that diabetes mellitus type 1 has on blood glucose levels. So this is reminding you of what the graph looks like for somebody who's not suffering the condition. This one up here, this graph here, is from somebody who suffers type 1 diabetes mellitus. See the levels here after someone has fed. So at this point here, we've ingested glucose. Glucose levels in both cases are rising. In a non-diabetic individual, there's this brief rise, and then the insulin is secreted, and then the glucose levels rapidly fall back down again to the original resting levels. In the diabetes mellitus type 1, however, no insulin is being made. As a consequence, after the meals, blood glucose levels go very high. They take a long time to fall. Now, this high blood glucose can cause problems. The body will tend to rely more on fat and protein for energy. It can lead to muscle wastage and increase in fatty acids in the blood. So let's just summarize a couple of key concepts at this point. Hormones are substances secreted by endocrine cells or glands which enter their bloodstream. These hormones then target cells somewhere else in the body. The cells must have a specific receptor for that hormone. The receptors can be in the cell membrane or within the cell. Now, it's very important that the level of hormone being secreted is carefully controlled. Too much or too little of a particular hormone can have serious consequences for the body, and this shows just how important hormones are for maintaining homeostasis. And that concludes the lecture.